Turmoil in the streets of Venezuela.
International condemnation of the government. Shortages of everything, from money to food. People rummage through rubbish.
Nicolas Maduro, get out.
Keeping that dictatorship afloat.
President Trump
Fired rubber bullets and tear gas.
The protest against the government's been going on for months.
3 million Venezuelans have left their country.
As you can see, Venezuela has been going through an economical and political crisis, but it hasn't always been like that. Let's get into it. It's 1922 and we are in Maracaibo, Venezuela. An oil well is discovered and is producing 100,000 barrels per day. By 1928, Venezuela is the second biggest petroleum exporter. This allowed for Venezuela to grow as a country. By 1943, almost all countries were getting oil from Venezuela or the United States. Three main companies were investing into Venezuela's oil. These companies were the Gulf, Standard Oil, and Royal Dutch Shell. The Royal Dutch Shell Company was from the UK. Meanwhile, the Gulf and Standard Oil were American companies. Also during this year, a Venezuelan law was passed. This law essentially said that whoever invested into the Venezuelan oil company had to give at least half of the profits. Anywho, we skip on over to 1958 and we learn about a small agreement made by an anthropologist who was hired by the then president. This agreement basically said that political parties had a fair share in government ministries, jobs, and etc., which would leave oil revenues in the government's hands, which would be one of the causes for the country collapsing. However, that doesn't happen for a couple of years because from 1928 through early 1980s, the country was at its highest, due to another agreement that made oil prices quadruple, which made Venezuela earn more money. However, at this point, the country is run by powerful families. Now we jump over to the late 1980s and oil prices plummet, leading to the then president to struggle keeping the nation afloat. However, he couldn't, and Venezuela was in $33 billion in foreign debt. Venezuela was forced to accept an international fund. This was the beginning of Venezuela's political and economical collapse. The big cause of Venezuela's political and economical collapse was Hugo Chavez. He was elected in 1999, and by the span of a decade and a half, he began on a massive social spending binge. He was spending money on health, food, educational, and housing programs. The government redirected oil profits to address these pressing social inequalities. The program did significantly reduce poverty, but they increased the dependence on oil. Chavez wanted to expand Venezuelan influence, so he provided subsidized oil to Cuba in exchange for Cuban doctors and teachers. He also sold to other South American countries and China by giving them below market rates. This gave them some positive relationships in the long run. During Chavez's presidency, he also neglected spending money maintaining oil facilities, which made oil production decline. His presidency came to an end when he was diagnosed with cancer. He passed away on March 5, 2013. This is when Nicolas Maduro is elected. He was Hugo Chavez's second hand. In 2018, at a Ministry of Defense event, Maduro says that he wants to boost oil output by 1 million barrels a day. This, however, didn't work. Also, remember earlier when a small agreement was mentioned? Well, it's still in place currently, which is bad, because the country now depends on oil revenues. But because Venezuela doesn't produce enough oil, it can't produce any security for its people. The country is now the second largest migration crisis in the world. The country also doesn't have food security nor regional stability. Also, corruption has become widespread. During Maduro's presidency, he was accused of corruption, violating basic tenets of democracy to maintain power, restricting access to internet, detaining and prosecuting political opponents, and creating a humanitarian crisis. The news outlet BBC also tells us a couple of new things in recent time. It tells us how Maduro's re-election was not fair and that it was corrupted. It also tells us about an interim president called Guido, who later is revoked of his position by many countries. It also tells us how U.S. sanctions didn't let Maduro's government have an easy way to sell oil. University of Denver also gives us two contributing factors for Venezuela's downfall: the U.S. sanctions and Venezuela's government, which allows us to see that it was not just Venezuela's presidents who drove the country to ruins. Now, it is significant to learn about this country because it ruined some political relationships, but it also improved others. There was a time where the US and Venezuela weren't on good terms. It was mainly because Nicolas Maduro dissed President Obama by saying that the US sanctions were not allowing Venezuela to prosper again, which was kind of embarrassing for Maduro because Obama dissed him back. They had a lot of beef, but we won't get into that. Now, that is all you need to know about Venezuela's political and economical collapse.